This 260 million project, useless.
Yesterday, bringing heavy rains and fierce winds. It was the 21st storm this year in the Philippines.
Good day everyone, I am Ritchel Pasadas, a student of Political Science 3-2 for Political Economy under Mr. Jumel Estrañero. In this video, I will be presenting a summary and synthesis of my final paper entitled The Political Economy of Philippine Flood Disaster When Profit Shapes Vulnerability. And this presentation argues that flood disasters in the Philippines are not merely natural events, but are politically and economically produced, shaped by corruption, governance failure, and environmental exploitation. The Philippines is globally recognized as one of the most disaster-prone countries due to its location along the Pacific Ring of Fire and within the Western Pacific Typhoon Belt. And every year, Filipinos experience typhoons, floods, earthquake, and landslide. However, the scale and repetition of devastation throughout these years raises a critical question. If disasters are natural, why are the impacts always catastrophic? Climate change indeed may intensify rainfall and storms, but it does not fully explain why flood control projects fail, why communities remain unprotected, and why Filipinos' vulnerabilities persist despite decades of disaster risk reduction policies. And this paper argues that disaster vulnerability is structurally produced, not by nature alone but by political decisions and economic interests. Despite existing flood control programs and disaster policies, flooding in the Philippines remains severe and recurring across urban and rural areas all over the year. And this study addresses the core problem, the governance failure, particularly corruption, the patronage politics, and weak environmental regulation, which have intensified throughout these years and through intensified flood disasters in the Philippines. Instead of treating corruption and quarrying as secondary issues, this paper positions them as essential drivers of disaster vulnerabilities. Using the political economy framework from our lessons, disasters are viewed not as accidents, but as an outcome of who benefits, who decides, and who is protected. Flood disasters occur within the systems, where infrastructures is treated as a profit opportunity, not public protection. Political elites prioritize short-term gains over long-term resilience. Vulnerability is concentrated among the poor and marginalized group. As Winster pressure and release model explains, disasters result from root causes, dynamic pressures, and unsafe conditions, wherein the root causes are the corruption and weak institution, and for dynamic pressures, we have urbanization and environmental degradation. And for unsafe conditions, we have informal settlers and poor infrastructures. One of the most alarming findings highlighted in this paper is the existence of 421 flood control projects reported as completed, but physically non-existent, according to the Commission of Audit reports, and this so-called ghost projects, which reveals overpricing of contracts, substandard construction materials, politically connected constructions, and weak monitoring and accountability of government. As a result, flood control structures collapses, even during moderate rainfall. This shows that infrastructure failure is not accidental. It is institutionalized, and flood control becomes a tool for patronage and profit, not for public protection. Beyond infrastructure, the study also finds out that the role of environmental destruction, particularly quarrying and deforestation, as quarrying and deforestation accelerates soil erosion, river siltation, reduce water holding capacity of rivers, in which permits are often granted through political exchanges, where environmental concerns are ignored, especially by the government and the local government units against the locality and local people in favor of economic benefit, in which the fragmented governance between the local government units and national agencies allow these practices to continue unchecked, and the result is weakened watersheds and increased flooding downstream. Moreover, disaster vulnerability is not evenly distributed, as marginalized communities, as those living along riverbanks, informal settlements, and rural areas experience poor housing quality, limited access to services, delayed or politicized relief distribution. Flood disasters, therefore, in the Philippines reinforce social inequality, where those least responsible suffer the most, and this confirms that vulnerability is politically produced, not naturally occurring. Given that flooding is fundamentally a governance problem, technical solutions alone are insufficient. So, this study advances several policy-oriented recommendations grounded in political economy. First recommendation is reform flood control governance. First, flood control infrastructure governance must be reformed, and this includes strengthening independent audits and third-party monitoring, making infrastructure projects publicly trackable, from budget allocation to physical completion, penalizing both contractors and public officials involved in ghost and substandard projects. And flood control projects must be evaluated based on actual projection and protection, not budget utilization. Second, environmental governance must be strengthened. Quarrying and deforestation moratoriums should be imposed in ecologically critical areas. Environmental impact assessment must be transparent and free from political interference. Restoring watersheds through reforestation and river rehabilitation is essential to reducing downstream flooding. And third is disaster governance requires institutional coordination. A more centralized and technically empowered disaster authority which can reduce overlap between different agencies in the government, in which local government units must be capacitated with technical training and stable funding for disaster risk reduction. And community-based disaster planning should be institutionalized, not optional. And lastly, disaster risk reduction must address social inequality. Relocation programs should be right-based and livelihood supported, as relief distribution must be insulated from political favoritism, and protecting vulnerabilities community is not charity, it is a matter of justice and accountability. To conclude, flooding in the Philippines is not simply a climate issue. It is a governance crisis, as climate hazards acts only as triggers. The real causes lies in corruption in infrastructure spending, environmental mismanagement, fragmented and politicized disaster governance. And as the study argues, flooding is a symptom of deeper political economic failures. And without addressing corruption and accountability, disaster risk will continue in the future and to escalate it further. And ultimately, the disasters of the recent years reminds us that Philippine vulnerability is not natural, it is constructed. And Filipinos' disasters resilience, therefore, is not just about the weather forecast, the evacuation, and other drills, but about political will, ethical governance, and prioritizing people over profit.